as Trekkies, we're very lucky that we get to attend conventions, we get to dress up together, we get to spend time together and share our passions. Now, some of these conventions are organised by fans and they might start in the basement of a hotel. Some are put on by much larger organisations. They might take up an entire arena from time to time. But what you always get running throughout it all is you get stories. Every single convention, every single time, you get stories. William Shatner may once have told fans to get a life, but to be fair, that was a Saturday Night Live sketch. And if he meant it or not, part of the fun is how much people get into it when it comes to these things. Even the very idea of conventions themselves have been parodied time and again. There's a certain British baby who would be animated and yet built a transporter and brought the crew of the Next Generation back together long before Star Trek Picard was doing it. Star Trek conventions proper are almost as old as Star Trek itself. When you have the letter writing campaigns and fanzines that brought Trekkies together to inspire a third series of Star Trek the original series going into 1969, by 1972 these Trekkies had organised the first large-scale convention of Star Trek in America. By the 1990s, Star Trek conventions had got so big they had even reached as far as, Ireland itself, with George Takei beaming in to hang out with some Irish Trekkies. Honest to God, this is hilarious. It was on the news. By the 2000s, you have things like Destination Trek and Mission Las Vegas that seem to be taking over. Let's not, of course, forget Comic-Con itself, although that's not a Star Trek convention per se. For this list, the wonderful Jack Kiley and our wonderful writer Clive Burrell have put together a list and notes and images from some of these conventions. So, without further ado, I'm Sean Ferrick for TrekCulture, and here are the 10 greatest Star Trek convention moments. Number 10. Live, Star Trek, live! Gene Roddenberry debuted Star Trek with a showing of both of the pilots at the World Science Fiction Convention in 1966. About 3 years later, just before the airing of Turnabout Intruder, about 300 people gathered in a New Jersey library for Star Trek Con. Now, it was just an afternoon and there was no celeb guests, but it was the beginning of what would go on to become a behemoth. Things really started to kick off in 1972 at the Star Trek Lives convention in New York. So organisers, they expected around 500 people, instead 3,000 turned up. Guests included Gene Roddenberry, Majel Barrett, Isaac Asimov and DC Fontana. They got to see some moon rocks and that infamous blooper reel as well. 1973 saw things get bigger with the International Star Trek Convention. You had guest hosts James Doohan and George Takei and a surprise appearance by Mr. Spock himself, Leonard Nimoy. There was about 6,000 attendees. 1974, the guest list expands to include Nichelle Nichols, DeForest Kelley, Walter Koenig, and there was about 15,000 attendees. William Shatner finally arrived in 1975, but that would see the beginning of a split between the organisers. That split, unfortunately, led to the end of Star Trek Lives, but more conventions had already begun to spring up across the world. The first official British convention took place in 1974, with James Doohan and George Takei attending, and much like the US counterpart, that had been preceded by a much smaller scale gathering of fans as well. Number 9. Oh, captains, 5 captains. This entry is actually a little bit heartbreaking because Jack, who wrote this, was this close to attending this convention and then something came up and listen, he couldn't have known. He couldn't have known. Destination Star Trek 2012 earned a bit of a bad rap. Fans were not massively thrilled with very long queues, some pretty pricey add-ons, and actually their complaints went as far as BBC's Watchdog. Having said that, about 18,000 people went, making it one of the largest Trek conventions in the world at that time. One of the major drawing points was the fact that all 5 then captains were gathered in the same room at this convention, and my heart breaks for Jack. It literally breaks, because this was not something that was going to happen very often again. The famous 5 captains all took to the stage during the opening ceremony. Just think about it. You had William Shatner, Patrick Stewart, Avery Brooks, Kate Mulgrew and Scott Bakula standing in front of you. This was a Trekkie's dream come true. They also sang a somewhat off-key rendition of Happy Birthday for a lucky audience member as well. They all brought their different stories. William Shatner commented on the time that he was signing a lady's breasts. Patrick Stewart felt like Sting. Scott Bakula basically dropped trousers for the moderator. Avery Brooks philosophized. Kate Mulgrew recounted the time that she was asked to marry a same-sex couple at another convention. Speaking of weddings, there were Klingon nuptials at Destination Star Trek as well, because nothing says romance like heavy prosthetics and paint sticks. Number 8, and one man in his time. Star Trek Picard's first and second seasons have been analysed and torn apart and built back up together again pretty much since they first aired. But go back before that, and there was a moment when all Trekkies were effectively joined in ecstasy. Having Jean-Luc Picard back on our screens was one of the most exciting things that we had ever thought of. And it was up to this unknown Shakespearean actor to make the announcement on stage. This occurred at the 2018 Star Trek Las Vegas convention. Alex Kurtzman was on stage and introduced his good friend. The doors opened and Patrick Stewart walked out on stage to a tidal wave of applause and stampeding, basically like you'd expect to hear at a Sunkatsi match. He was invited on stage to make an announcement, and in fairness, Patrick Stewart arriving on stage could have been enough to be the announcement itself. Because he was hardly going to walk up and say, "Hi everyone, Trip's not dead, Enterprise is back." Which would have been lovely, I'm not going to lie. But he got up on stage and said, "Jean-Luc Picard is back." Now, while I myself was watching this on video from across the world, I can tell you, my heart just started fluttering. There was eruptions of applause, and you could see Patrick Stewart in tears on stage. Stewart then went on to lay out a few caveats. We now know what they are. Like, Jean-Luc would no longer be a captain, and Picard may not even be the man that we recognize anymore. In a recent interview with the LA Times, Stewart expanded on what his basic rules were for returning. One was no uniform, and the other was no sentimental TNG reunion. Maybe he shouldn't watch season 3. Number 7, all aboard the good ship Mariner. This one might be a bit of a cheat if you're a bit of a purist about conventions, but as Garrick said to Bashir, let's go cruising. Star Trek The Cruise sails into its 7th incarnation in 2024, but this is actually not the first cruise of its kind in fandom. In May of 1987, Trek Cruise set off from Miami and featured such guests as Nichelle Nichols, James Doohan, DeForest Kelley, and George Takei in a lobster hat. I wonder what Walter Koenig must have felt standing there beside him. That same year, another Trek cruise took off from the West Coast, and right up until 2007, you had many cruises of this type, with Sea Trek and Slayer Cruise, as well as part of Volcon Entertainment. One of the highlights of the recent cruises took place on Star Trek The Cruise 5 in 2022, and it was an Enterprise panel featuring John Billingsley, Connor Trenier, Anthony Montgomery, and moderator Chase Masterson after an open bar. Questions and answers arose around Trip's underwear, those steamy decon scenes, Billingsley sort of chirping for his audition, Montgomery's thoughts on the cancellation, nipple issues, Florida accents, sexual relations, and ended on a contemplative question about the members of the cast. What I wouldn't give. Number 6, let's make it an anniversary we'll never forget. The cast of Star Trek Voyager have gotten together in various combinations over the years, but for the 20th anniversary of the show at Star Trek Las Vegas, the entire cast, well, minus Jennifer Leon, got together for the first time. The 2015 panel saw everyone together, enjoying being back together, and it was a very fun affair. And considering at that point the well-trodden story of tensions on the set of Star Trek Voyager were out there to the ether, it was particularly enjoyable to see Kate Mulgrew and Jerry Ryan laughing side by side. The entire reunion was a laugh riot. One New Zealand fan asked Robert Beltran to take off his shirt, and while he didn't oblige, he did say, well, why doesn't everyone take off their shirts? With Kate Mulgrew going, we'll make this a celebration you'll never forget. Ethan Phillips joked that Tim Russ once confided in him that he based his performance on Tuvok on a 2x4, and that Avery Brooks and he had been lovers for years. Mulgrew then addressed what she called the most erotic moment in the history of Star Trek, which was, of course, the lizard babies. And Jerry Ryan encouraged Tim Russ, Garrett Wang, Robert Duncan McNeil, and Beltran to get up and do the river dance that they refused to stop doing on set, really winding up a load of different directors. Number 5, take your stations. 2016 was a big year for Star Trek because finally the restraining orders had lapsed and Clive Burrell was able to gain access to Destination Star Trek Birmingham. This coincided quite nicely with the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, so there was a lot of celebrations all around. Clive was shoehorned, his words, in with the rest of the press onto the recreation of the original bridge of the Enterprise 1701. You might think, oh, was that uncomfortable or was this or that? No, probably not, because he was there to witness George Takei, Walter Koenig, and William Shatner take their posts on the bridge of the Enterprise for the first time since 1989. That's not all, because behind the captain's chair you had an array of Star Trek stars from the previous 50 years. Marina Sirtis, Jeffrey Combs playing half the crowd, Garrett Wang, Terry Farrell, Armin Shimmerman, Connor Trenier, and more. Clive was stood there and he even worked up the courage to ask William Shatner if there was anything you could change over the last 50 years of Star Trek, what would it be? To which Shatner goes, why would you be so callow as to think you could change anything? And to this day, Clive is still applying ointment to that burn. Number 4, open hail. In 2019, Nichelle Nichols announced that she would be doing the convention circuit for the last time, with a convention called Hailing Frequencies Open One Last Time. That was planned for May of 2020, but of course the pandemic caused everything to get pushed back and pushed back. This would also then happen in the shadow of some very serious elder abuse allegations that came out around people who had surrounded themselves around Nichelle Nichols in her last few years of her life. Nichols did get to say her final goodbye at LA Comic-Con in December of 2021, just months before she passed away. Nichelle Nichols was devoted to Star Trek fans, and she had made the convention circuits since the 1970s, appearing, doing talks and showing off her wonderful singing voice. So with that, it's kind of hard to pick like a greatest moment for her, but there was a very, very incredible moment at the 2016 Las Vegas convention. In 2016, Nichols was joined for the first time at a Star Trek convention by Whoopi Goldberg, who, as part of the celebrations for the 50th anniversary, was making her first appearance at a Star Trek convention. And of course, she spoke at length about how Nichols had been her inspiration for not only joining Star Trek, but for getting out and getting into the world of acting and performing as well. While Whoopi reiterated how she felt about Nichols, Nichols very sweetly and magnanimously countered with the idea that Whoopi was the personification of what women could, should, and would become. Star Trek Strange New Worlds put it beautifully recently when they added a tribute to one of their episodes. For Nichelle, who was first through the door and showed us the stars, hailing frequencies forever open. Number 3, the Shatner and Stewart, and a surprise Sauron. 2 legendary captains come face to face with the man who killed one of them. This may sound like the blurb from one of William Shatner's follow-up novels to Star Trek Generations, but it actually set the scene for 2012's Montreal Comic-Con reunion of the Generations, in Shatner's hometown no less, that saw William Shatner, Patrick Stewart, and Alexander Siddig's uncle, famously not a fan of watches, Malcolm McDowell, take the stage together. Shatner and Stewart clearly had great chemistry together. They had done a wee tour of the city beforehand, and they spent the panel sort of jibing each other. They were joined all too briefly by Malcolm McDowell, who came out on stage to comment on Kirk's kinda naff death. Shatner would then go on to open up about the time that when he was suffering stomach flu during a performance on stage, he boldly went And then also revealed that both he and Patrick Stewart were wearing women's lingerie for the horseback scene in Generations, as it was more comfortable, providing less chafing. There was a little bit of a muddled ending when, questions to the floor were opened up and a fan asked the three about gay representation in Star Trek, which, to be fair, I don't think they had been prepped for a response to. But Stewart did then drop a joke about Data after being asked, what about Data? About him being fully functional with 3 operating speeds. Something Brent Spiner once joked were set to the opening notes of Alexander Courage's fanfare. That's something we didn't think we'd learn today, isn't it? Number 2, bangers and mash for lunch. When asked about her favourite Star Trek convention, Mulgrew said during the opening ceremony of Destination Star Trek London 2012 that she couldn't remember her first convention, but she claimed her favourite moment had happened in the UK in Blackpool. It was the 2001 Voyager The Return convention, and there would have been a bit of a familiar face at Norbreck Castle Hotel. It would have been Jack Kiley. This was just before Endgame was about to air, and fans of the UK obviously didn't know what was going to happen. So to tide them over, Kate Mulgrew offered a free autograph to attendees, and I believe behind 17 laser wires, several guard dogs, and Lieutenant Shax, Jack Kiley still got his. Patrick Stewart made a guest appearance on the Sunday as well. Robert Picardo, who is bloody funny, gave a hilarious stand-up routine. He commented on the naming practices in the UK, and he says, Blackpool. Why not just call it Scum Puddle? I'm just repeating the joke. He said he was planning on bangers and mash for lunch, and he didn't know what was for dinner, but he was going to be having a bit of spotted dick for dessert. Again, I'm just repeating the joke. Another highlight came from the auctions that went toward Mulgrew's Alzheimer charity. An autographed edition of the script for Hunters went for £5,500, which is fairly incredible. Then Keegan Delancey appeared on stage, auctioning off a pair of his dad, Q, his underwear that had "To Boldly Go" written on the front of it, and John Delancey sat here on the back of it. Now Keegan, he stressed to say, these are clean, but they have been worn. And then he proceeded to put them on his head. Number 1, seen any good movies lately? Just 2 years before Leonard Nimoy would make his well-earned retirement from the convention circuit, he joined William Shatner on stage at DragonCon 2009. And in his opening, probably planned, speech, he kind of not jokingly said to William Shatner, "Why is George Takei so angry at you?" Shatner and Takei's feud is almost as old as Star Trek itself, and Nimoy clearly enjoyed poking the bear a little bit there. Later on, Shatner didn't miss an opportunity to rhyme Takei's name with decay, much to the shock of the audience and to the exasperated headshake of Nimoy. In general, the panel was a very good-natured riffing between these two people, and a lot of Nimoy's exasperated head-shaking over some of his former colleagues' more questionable comments. Overall, by all accounts, it was a delight to watch. At times, Shatner showed great self-deprecating humour, and then at other times he openly mocked the audience, which was of course less funny, and he kind of closed with a bit of an embittered speech about the then upcoming Emmys. Nimoy was careful to get his shot in there. It became a bit of a running joke when he turned to Shatner and said, "Seen any good movies lately?" Because Nimoy had been in a fairly large movie in 2009. That is everything for this list. Folks, thank you so much for watching along. And I want to hear from you as well. What are your convention moments and stories? Thank you so much to both Jack and Clive Burrell, and of course Martin as well, the three of whom put together this video just fantastically. Half the fun that we get to do as Star Trek fans is to share our stories of our experiences and our joy and even our sorrows sometimes. So in the comments below and over on the socials, we want to hear your stories. So remember, you can follow us on Twitter at TrekCulture. We're on Instagram at TrekCultureYT. We're on Blue Sky at TrekCulture as well. I am at Sean Ferrick on the various socials. Clive is at SKOST, and Jack is at JackKiley74656. Make sure to drop everyone a follow. Folks, look after yourselves, live long and prosper, share stories of joy, stories of happiness. The world is... Look, I hardly need to tell you. So try and be calm, try and lead with peace. take a second look when it comes to headlines as well. I want to be serious about them because at the moment there is so much misinformation flying everywhere. So let's all of us take a breath when we see something and open our mind. Do what those Starfleet officers would do. Folks, thank you so much. You're awesome. You're wonderful. You are beautiful. Have a wonderful, however long it is till I see you again. Make it so. I'm going to die. I got chills doing that one.